Hi, my name is Benedict. I'm going to expand on the series that I just made about oscillator waveforms, and then into wave shaping, which you can apply to an individual oscillator waveform, or you can apply to parts of a mix, either an individual instrument in a mix to give it a certain character, or to whole slabs of a mix. Commonly we do that with saturation or something like that, but there's absolutely no reason in theory that you couldn't ring modulate a whole section of a mix. I mean, got the small faces engineer phased the whole mix for Ichiku Park, and that was a kind of wave shaping. But now I want to move into sort of a new section of what we're doing. It's kind of the next step. The next obvious step may have been to talk about filters and stuff like that. Maybe another time I'll go through and do blah 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 about filter types. But I think you kind of work them out as you go. Learning more about them, yes, can be useful. But for the moment, I think for beginners or people who are looking to really deepen their understanding, the next thing is, how do I make sounds? How do I make sounds that have a use and a purpose? So, slightly longer intro than you thought, but remember, thinking guy, we're going to start with bass sounds. You probably worked that out because I'm looking at a Wikipedia article about bass sounds, the musical role of bass. Bass notes are played in a musical ensemble, frequently used to provide a counterpoint or counter melody. Please don't forget that. You know, if your melodic lead is going and your bass line is going, there are times where that's effective, it's powerful, but if it's all you ever do, it all becomes a bit pointless. Whereas if you're going, okay, not great composition or play, but there's some difference there. It's doing something a little bit more interesting than just cloning. So, counterpoint, melody. The reason I'm going over this before I get into turning knobs is, remember, thinking. What's a bass? Why would we use it? What's its role? What's it supposed to do? So it underpins the melodic movement. So it'll be the chordal movement and even possibly into the melodic or lead line movement of what we're doing. Commonly it ties down, so the most obvious thing is if we play a chord, our bass is the root. Playing the bass with the chord makes the whole chord sound more meaty. That's one of the most common things that people think about with bass and bass lines, which leads to the second half of that, is the rhythmic part of it. The typical trance kick, kick, kick. The melodic aspect of it, but there's a lot of emphasis on bass in the EDM styles, simply because they're looking for power, and then they forget, and this is the negative side of EDM, really is very sad, with such huge sounds and all of that, is they forget that we need to be building melody, because mixes, and the same is happening in metal and rock and pop and everything, mixes are not meant to sound big. They're meant to feel big. And one of the best ways to make something feel big is to have a great melody. Final countdown. That sounds immense. It's a big mix, sure. But even without any mix, it feels immense. That's a brilliant hook, and it still has currency well over 30 years later. Same with Van Halen's Jump. Ba, 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 ba. Massive feel to it. So before we get into making any sound, ask ourselves, always ask yourself, what is the role of this sound? What part does it play in the story that I am creating? If you don't have that sense, you're probably going to end up with the wrong thing. Now, the first thing that I'll cover here is, again, and I know people will want to go, just only tell me the positives, but no, I'm also going to tell you, though, don't do these things. Or at least if you're doing these things, realize that there's a caveat or a potential for problem with this. There's a tendency to make what people are calling bass sounds that is not a bass sound. That's a lead sound. It may have some activity in the bass range, but when this is your whole that's not actually a bass sound, that's your lead sound, which is probably going to lead you to some confusion later. So if you're purely here to work out how to make what basses, EDM basses, or what have you, if I get into that, I'm going to get into that in leads, not in basses. Because basses are designed to underpin your chords, your melodies, your harmonies, and at times to provide a little counterpoint. In the last video I talked about boom, 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 boom. That's counterpoint. Your main melody is doing one thing, and then your bass does something else for a moment, counterpoint. So, to the oscillatorium. Let's turn this off. And again, just housekeeping, I've got a little bit of echo happening here. That's just because without it, it sounds really dry and it's hard for anybody to want to listen to. We'll run through our waves. This seems like an absolute winner for bass, doesn't it? Because it's so bassy. Problem with it, if we only use a sine wave in a mix, is that it's going to disappear. That doesn't sound very bassy because we've got all these higher harmonics. So they reduce the perception of the bassiness, even though you can see your fundamental is just as loud. All of this stuff masks. In other words, it gets in the way of you hearing that other thing. Masks. So very tempting to say, but because that doesn't have a lot of cut, as soon as you put other things on top of that, you're basically going to find that disappears. I know some of you are sitting there chafing, wanting to leave, because you go, oh, but if you have a sub, then it's Ilan. Great. If you can guarantee that every single person who listens to your track has a sub that's well enough set up to hear your fundamental, brilliant, go for it. However, if you can't guarantee that every single person who's going to be listening to your track has a sub that's fit for the frequency you plan on outputting, you need another strategy. And that is to make sure that you have some upper harmonics. Straight away, this is giving us a lot of the oomphy feel of the sine wave, but those upper harmonics, I'm dragging it forward so we can hear that better. That is just too bright to work as a bass sound. Because as I've said, it's essentially become a lead. It's got so much wah happening up here in the top end, it's just going to rip through whatever you play. Imagine trying to play the chords from Jump over the top of that. Ugh, it's just not going to happen. So, this is when we introduce our very best friend, the filter. We've now created a bass sound. It's in the bass range. We could leave that here. Technically, bass is anything from an octave below middle C. Middle C being here, there down is bass. You could call anything below middle C bass too if you like, but generally speaking an octave below. Once we go too low, that sound starts to break up. Plus it's really only hearable. See, our peak energy here is just above 20 Hertz. I'm hearing that even in these cans, but the reality is I'm not really hearing this. I'm hearing more of this, but I'm also just hearing the speaker cones flap. What? Sounds like a motorbike. So be cautious. Very tempting to go right down here, but that's just going to disappear in a mix unless you find some other trick to pull it through, which we can talk about in a mo. So the next thing we look at, our straight bass sound, is a way to pull it through. When you listen to a bass player, bong, bong, he actually picks that string, either with his fingers, few play with a pick, but watch Gene Simmons. He looks super cool when he plays that, with his tongue hanging out. But you can really see him at each one of those strings. It gives it a real drive. What we're doing there is this. We've taken an envelope shape and turned up. Now that's too slow for your average bass sound. There are times where you use something like that, but it's giving you a sense of how an envelope works if you don't know a lot about it. So we're turning up the volume, or turning up the filter. See it in your mind's eye as though this was doing this in time with the envelope. So we're using our upper harmonics to cut through. With that. And you've got a couple of ways of going. If you want it to be an aggressive bass, you can use a very short decay. So it's a really punchy sound. You can even choose to make your amplitude envelope really short. Technically that's still a bass sound. It's playing in the bass register. The problem we've got with it being so short is that it's not playing long enough for those bass frequencies to really develop. See how it takes some time for those bass frequencies to really develop, in part because of our envelope, but even if we reduce it like that, there still just isn't that feeling of the bass sound, bassiness. It needs time. So if you need a fast bass line, you might possibly want to have a couple of layers, possibly even write your bass line twice. You might write one bass sound, which is another one, which is or any variation thereof. You might layer the two sounds even and still just keep your long sound, but by popping the two together. Or of course but in a mix you'll find that by combining the two, they don't quite have the same feel as this. So that's where you get into layering. Now I know it's possible to say let's put another oscillator in here and have it do that. Yeah, it can work. got our little pop to pull us through. But the reality is, by the time you're chasing that sort of feel, you're probably looking for something immense. You're better off making two completely separate sounds and then layering them together. If you find that they're not quite gelling, then apply some compression. Careful compression, don't just flatten the buggery out of it, because you've achieved nothing. You've now got no feel left in it, unless of course that's the whole idea. But just a little bit of compression to say, effectively I'm smushing the two of these together to become one sound. You got to see how you go, that's a mixing issue. So that essentially is how you make a bass sound. There's not a lot more to it than that. It's how you're playing your sound that then defines a lot of the other things that go on around it. And you may go, yeah, thanks Captain Obvious, you've told me nothing. No, I've told you a whole pile of stuff. Let's look at building a few more things on top of it then. The next one you'll hear is to, say, put a soft clip on it. Remember what this did? Nice and bassy, no cut. Let's put a clipper on it. We've started to introduce some more harmonics. Let's get a bit more aggressive. So it's simply another way of wave shaping, of adding harmonics, changing our core wave. Don't see it as being any special trick at all, because it's fundamentally not an awful lot different from doing this. It's just that's a very even set of harmonics. When you're using clippers, you're using less even sets of harmonics. Like see here, we've got, whoops, point with this. This is not exactly an even progression. We've got some of this and not so much of that, and some more of this, and it's a bit of a mess. It's all over the place. Non-linear being the term for that. But there's no reason why you can't do that by creating your own wave shape in the first place, especially if we were playing with a more digital type synth like Europa. So don't feel like clippers are the only way to do it. Sometimes it's the lazy way out, because as I pointed out in the earlier article, sometimes you have less control when you're using some sort of clipper or wave shaper than you would if you were looking back at your wave saying, what is it that I need in this sound? Never be afraid of a sound being quite bright, because we can do another thing. There are a couple of ways of doing this. That's not the same sound as, they can be similar, but in this case you've got your envelope here. In this case you don't. So even though we've kept a very bright sound between the oscillator and the filter, we've now used another filter, or I'm going to say equalizer. We've used an EQ, a tone control, to change the tone of the overall sound. That punch that we put in here, see how it's still there? But the overall brightness of the sound is taken away by our tone control, our equalization. So a second, if you're wanting a really warm bass sound, like what we're hearing, but you're going, yeah, but it's a bit too polite, I need a bit of, let's get manly about it. In which case, then we can put in quite a large envelope, and our tone control is saying, yeah, we're going to have all that stuff, but we're also going to control it in another way. So we've now got a really punchy, meaty bass sound. If we wanted to brighten that up a bit more, that, which is pre-filter, I guess it's pre this tone control, or of course we could do this fella. Hear how it's got that higher frequency, that tick. The problem with this particular fella is that as you drive it, it doesn't turn its own level down, so whatever you do sounds better because it just gets louder. So I don't recommend that. It's a Butte device, it sounds great, but just be aware that when you use it, as you turn the drive up, you're not only hearing the loveliness of the saturation, the wave shaping, but you're just hearing the sound louder. Any louder sound always sounds better than the same thing not as loud. It's just the way it works. But don't fall for it. So that's a second way to have a really warm sound with lots of overtones, but to control them. And so you can control with another filter, or you can control with an equalizer. We might say, I want to get rid of some of that, but I did like some of that tick I was putting in before. There it is. So we've transitioned our sound from this, which is a bit hard, to something that's quite grunty and mean, without actually using any overdrive at all. We're merely saying, I want more of this, I want more of that, but I don't want as much of that. The other thing that you can do with your bass sound, compressors. This is a very polite compressor, really polite compressor. So in some ways you want to push it harder than you would another device. We'll start with the classic default position. Thank you to Stav for mixing with your mind. Plaster that thing against the wall. That's giving me a nice tick. Set your recovery time. Obviously that all depends on the performance. Be randomly playing notes. This is the bit where it gets tricky, because like this is going to sound kind of not very good because it's strangled. Finding the point where your threshold is best set. Initially as you turn the volume up, it just sounds better and better because it becomes louder and more dynamic. So louder, we got to know, is not better, it's merely louder. Lots of dynamics are good, but within a mix lots of dynamics can become a problem, because it can mean that when it's loud you hear it, when it's not so loud it's gone. So a compressor is a good way of evening that dynamic so that you can find a balance. Though when it's loud it's good and present, when it's not as loud it's still present, rather than gone. That feels about right. Being subtle, but what we've chased there is just this extra little tiny bit of tick. I'm not going to recommend doing that outside of a mix. I'll rarely do that outside of a mix. It's one of the few times that I've done it outside of a mix. I'll do that inside a mix. My sound's kind of right, I'll then say, look, I'm looking for these qualities because of the mix. I need a little bit more tick on this fella to pull him through. I want a bit more tick because I want this just to sound a little bit more brutal. Any of those things. There's the reasons why I do these things. I know it's very fashionable to sit there with tons and tons of processors and come up with a big mean sound. But what's the purpose of said big mean sound? Why is it there? Then you can struggle with your mix down the track, especially when you've got 20 big mean sounds all on top of each other. Yeah, okay, great. that's just mush. Of course, if we were to be using our drive, but again, it comes down to what we need it to do. So we get rid of those. A sawtooth is not a bad thing to look for in any sand. If you're unsure, start with a sawtooth. Unless you're specifically making TB303 or SH101 type sands, resonance is not always your friend. It can be if it helps pull the sand through. So that's just another way of adding back in upper harmonics. So rather than seeing your resonance as some kind of magical pixie dust, see your resonance as being like an EQ. Because in essence, if we look here, let's just leave this. It's just turned up something. You look at a plot of a filter curve, you see it come on, the line come along and then it curves down. When there's resonance, line comes along, it hoiks up and then goes down. All it does is turn up the volume at that particular point in the frequency band. It's just an EQ. You can actually create resonance with an EQ. We can, matter of fact, we will do it right now just to prove this to you. Showing you this because it's easy to think of some types of things as being more magical than others. See? Really sounds essentially the same as resonance. But be aware that most filter types, particularly those based around the Moog ladder type filter, so most 24 dB roll-offs, will be an equal power. So in other words, as you raise this, that spike that you just saw in the EQ, that's adding volume. It's adding, I don't know what the actual add is on a 24 dB filter, but that could be adding 24, 30, 48 dB of extra volume to your sound. It's not adding it everywhere, but it's adding it at one point, which is why it suddenly gets peaky and goes whee! So what your filter will do inside itself is, rather than just going straight into Splatsville, distorting, it'll turn its overall volume down. So, nice and bassy. Lost just about all our lovely round bassiness because we're loud up here. Some filters don't, but you'll find most do, so it's best to assume that they will, and use your resonance either as a full-on effect or as an EQ. When you understand it in those terms, then rather than automatically thinking that resonance is all just about creating TB303 sounds, it's not. It's about changing the timbre, the tone. It gets harder. This thing, where they do that, was essentially a mistake. It wasn't like they set out in the first place to say, ooh, let's create TB303 sounds. They were a mistake. They were actually a failing of that unit to some extent. It wasn't planned to do those. It was planned to do this. The fact that people got off on that was by the by. But use your resonance as a way of merely emphasizing, and remember some synths call it emphasis, emphasizing the cutoff point. So you're actually making your sound a bit brighter, and a little bit more metallic. I was taught that. I think it was this, I actually can't remember what it was, to be very honest. It was like turn up the resonance to get a more metallic sound. Could have been Craig Anderton in the Emacs manual. I really don't know, but that was the most common way of putting it at the time. It wasn't until sort of the early 90s where suddenly everybody became obsessed with TV303s, that resonance became this obsession with squeaky, chirpy sounds. Cool, amusing, but it's put a lot of people off. The next waveform you might look at is the square wave. Square waves are really interesting because they've only got half of the overtones being played. All of them are being played in this fella. Here how it's sort of warm and soft. Half of them here. So it actually means that your fundamental ends up being louder, which makes it more bassy. It also sounds hollow. Hear how it's got a sort of tubey. Sounds a little like a sound being heard through a PVC tube, and they used to call it tubey as a result. So they make a very nice way of adding a lot of low end while still adding some cut. Next one we look at is sub-oscillators. A sub-oscillator is an oscillator that plays below the fundamental. So if our fundamental is here, our sub is going to play, generally speaking, an octave below. So here, here. It is primarily used just as a way of putting more meat into your bass sound, because some people feel like their bass sound isn't meaty enough, so we add more of it in. We can put it on the same octave as well. But as you see, sometimes the fundamental gets louder, sometimes it gets quieter. A lot of times it can be quieter. Now that depends on your synth. If they're a free running oscillator like they are in Thor, as in the wave phase, like where the wave starts is in a different place every time you play your oscillator, when you put the two together, they're not perfectly in line with each other. They can be offset from one another. And when things are offset from one another, they tend to cancel each other out. You've watched Star Trek, you know how that works. You solve every problem by giving the problem an inverted version of itself, and episode's finished. Free running oscillators give you a really nice warm sound because they're different every time. But if you want to sync them together and force them to stay the same, then you need synced oscillators, which can be often as a phase button or something like that. A few synths, notably the SH synths, they had, I think it was commonly three oscillator forms, and you could just slide them all up and balance them all together. They were actually one oscillator outputting those different forms, those different shapes, which meant that they were synced to one another, which is part of why they were so popular for bass sounds, because it meant that they were always synced together. But you did get a harder sound because it was the same every time. So if you're not sure whether a synth does it, look at what I just did here. See how sometimes it just goes whoop loud? That tells you that they're free running. So either look for a button that says, lock the phase together, which is here or sometimes up here, but it isn't on this synth, and it's not a bad thing because mostly you'll want to leave it off. So turn that on. Or failing that, if you particularly like the sound that you're getting just from this instrument, then sample off each of these oscillators. Make sure that their waveforms in your wave editor are nice and neat and tidy, so they're starting in the same place every time. And then put them in a sampler. Because your sampler will always play from the beginning. Unless you've asked it to play from somewhere else, it'll always play from the beginning, which means that it's locked, just like an SH. But if you drop this an octave, they're not on top of each other, they're separated from each other, so it doesn't really matter if they're up. You can go 2 down, 2 octaves down, but if we listen to that fella, he's off the bottom of the world. So you're not necessarily getting any reliable bass boost, especially if 100% of your listeners don't have that. They're often used for leads. 1 octave below is the most common. Experiment, see how you go, but make sure it's working outside of your system. Because if you're listening on your system with a sub that's bigger than your ego, then it's going to sound great. But as soon as you take it somewhere else, put it on your speaker, on your phone or something like that, goodbye. 1 octave down, we can look at the mix of it. So we've now got the choice of none of it to only the lower one, which means we can do things like keeping the draw where we need it to be, which is here, or we can do something like giving ourselves an overtone. So that would generally be done this way, which is essentially additive synthesis. That's additive synthesis. We're giving ourselves an overtone. It's a sub-oscillator that's actually playing above. Who cares? It's another trick that you can use. So if you've got your This is a really good trick to know. It's commonly used in EQing for basses. There's our bass sound. If we're playing it on a tiny speaker that doesn't have a lot of down low, it's going to kind of fall off the bottom of the mix. Problem, how do we solve that? Easy. Use psychoacoustics, use the brain. You've got your series of harmonics here. Oddly enough, when the brain hears this, it looks for this. So, if we take our sound and emphasize this a little bit, that sound immediately sounds bassier, even though we've made it less bassy. So, mixing trick, or if you're working in a synth, which means you can change the sound, you can do something as simple as taking a sine oscillator, adding it in 1 octave above. So octave 3, octave 4. 1 octave above. And people will perceive that to be a bigger, fuller, smoother bass than it really is. Tricky, tricky, tricky. If you've got a Waves bass boost on your computer, that's what it's doing. If you've got a bass boost button on your little Bluetooth tub speaker, that's what it's doing. So why not set it up at the beginning? No reason why you can't. That's basically it. So then you can just experiment with combinations thereof. Pair of squares. Actually, it's not square. It's square now. There's a square and a pulse. Beautiful. That's really neat. It's really grunty sound. Bit hollower, but it'll sit underneath the mix if you've got less going, so more going on above. By having less harmonics, there's less fight with what you're doing. So try different things till you find the thing that works well. I personally am not a big fan of the standard sine underneath. I don't love it. People do, I don't. I think that's mostly it for creating a bass sound. Oh, actually no, I'll run you through a couple of other things. I'll get rid of this fella, and we'll switch to, we'll do this first. I know you all want to make the biggest, widest sound known to mankind. It's really all you're doing is taking some sort of multiple oscillator. You can line up single oscillators if you like, but it's just easy if you've got one unison type thing. Sounds wonderful. But remember, when it's up here, when it's that bright, it's no longer a bass sound. You can, well, you like, but it's not a bass sound, it's a lead sound. There it is as a bass sound. Be careful though with chorusing. We've got ourselves a nice wide stereo chorus, sounds beautiful, but be cautious about what's going to happen in your mix. If you're finding that your bass seems unfocused, that you're struggling with your bass, and you've got it stereoed, look at that. You may want to narrow that down a little bit. Sometimes there's only one way to get that sound, and that's to be that wide, but just see what's going to happen when it collapses to mono. And if everything else in your mix is tons and tons of stereo, and then you've got this even wider stereo bass underneath because, you know, it made you feel like wanting to take your pants off when it was in solo, you're still going to really struggle to mix that because everything's wide. Therefore, everything's out there. And as you see, my hands have fallen off because they're too wide. We've got to keep them within the box. So widen your bass right out if you want to, narrow down the sounds above it. So it's a sense of context and contrast. Or have nice wide sounds, huge wide string and pad sounds or whatever, or your leads, kind of sounds can be super wide and wide. It's going to make them really be like, ooh. And then essentially a V shape in your stereo-ness of your mix, pull that down to the bit that's having the real manliness can be a lot more mono. So multiple oscillator stuff, go for it, just understand what you're doing. The other form that you'll encounter, we don't want that fella now. You might be thinking, okay, how do I make an FM bass? Everyone's obsessed with retro wavy type stuff. Basically, you're looking to take advantage of the sine wave, see how pure that sine is. And in this instance, your sines are actually locked together. Your FM pair in this device, now I think about it and remember, they're locked together. See? Same every time. So that's additive. I'll turn that off. If we So that's the essence of the DX100 sub bass, which was taking advantage of the bassiness of the sine wave and then adding a little bit of punch. Now people are calling them 808 basses or whatever. Same bloody thing. It's just adding a bit of It's all just in how you make that sound. And if you go back and have a look at the digital waveform article, the video in particular, you'll see me wander through showing you how to define and create and finesse your raw sound. We can be lazy and reach for a filter. But we're losing some of the wonderful hard digital FM-y sort of feel of it. But if you wonder about FM basses, that's basically it. But as we get into higher modulators, then it starts to get more and more high frequencies, so it starts to move away from your classic bass thinking. Play around with it, find what works in the story of your mix. I think there was one more thing that I was going to run through. What else do we need to know about when we're making basses? Honestly, that's mostly it. Your bass will work best when it's played well. Played well is to understand the rhythm of your piece. So if we're in 4/4, the general rule of thumb is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So push hard on your 1. That's your general rule of thumb. So if you're playing in a rock band, clunk down on that 1. If you're playing in something that's funk, or what I call as flat funk, electro funk type stuff, then if you're playing your bass line, then that just comes down to feel. But again, you've just got to get that feel funkin' right in the first place. But the way where you put your bass sounds, where you put your notes, is going to have a huge impact on how your line feels. So bear in mind, bass sounds are slow because they're big. It takes time. Remember, if we get rid of the time element, they cease to be bassy. So give them the time to speak. There's no point sort of going, I want my piece to be fast, so I'm going to have 30-second bass notes. You'll then wonder why it doesn't sound like that great a piece. You just don't have the punch that you want. You're either going to be trying to add multiple bass lines at once, which is it can work great, but it can backfire really badly. You know, it's why a solo violin actually has more punch than a whole orchestra verse sort of set of violins when they're playing an intricate melody. That's why the chorus of violins will be doing this, whilst the guy at the front is, because a solo instrument will have more power in a mix. So don't feel like you want to add everything into your bass arena or run multiple bass lines unless they're simple and playing off against each other. Keep them as simple as that, and you'll find that they will tend to be more effective and more powerful. Because then if you want to have extra stuff, then you can start to use melodic lines, hooks, extra things in the middle to build your rhythm out of multiple parts. James Brown's backing band was like that. Each player was playing a few little bits, and the other guy was going, put them together, and you ended up with this amazing sound. That was funk. But you took any individual player and they weren't doing an awful lot. When you build your mix, rather than going, I want my bass to do absolutely everything and make a storming track just in my bass, you're going to find that you hit a wall real hard, real soon, and you don't really know why, because you're actually asking your bass to do too much. Let it sit below things, define what's going on, and then you can add another instrument, possibly even an octave higher. You don't want them all playing in the same place. So you might laugh at that, but that was an incredibly successful style of bass line for a decade, and would have stayed so if it wasn't for the fact that people decided to be uncool about it. It's still an incredibly successful kind of bass line because you've really got and offset. See what I mean? They've used one instrument, but you can do that with two instruments, or you can, again, one instrument or two instruments. So think outside of the idea of saying I need to have one sound do absolutely everything, especially a bass sound, because it limits you. Have your bass do the fundamentals of what it's designed to do. You can then have it do it if you wanted to, and you can play it properly, because I sure can't. But you're better off bringing in another instrument, and then suddenly you'll go, oh my god, isn't that great? Because your bass is doing what your bass is good at, your next sound's doing what that's good at, your sound above it's doing what that's good at. By putting the bits and pieces of them together, you've got 3 or 4 sounds which are working together, and they're going to feel immense, which brings us right back to where we started. The idea is we want to feel immense, not necessarily to be immense. Because once you feel immense, then you've grabbed people where it really counts, and they'll stick with you. That's why most of us can recognise or even sing off Europe's The Final Countdown, even if we're not from that generation, just because it works so well. Once it gets you, it's in there, and it's in there for good. So your basses, work on them doing what they want to do and should do, no more. And that will help grab people by the feelies, far more than the idea of saying that they've got to be immense and doing tons and tons of stuff, whether that's frequency-wise, volume-wise, or note-wise. Let your other things do the job. I hope that's been helpful for you, and I'll look at some other sounds soon.